Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be starting period 3, which is 1754 to 1800. This makes up about 12% of the AP test, and this is chapters 4, 5, and 6 in our textbook. It goes basically from the pre-revolutionary time period, and it goes all the way through the founding Federalist era, which basically means the presidencies of Washington and Adams. It ends with the election of 1800, with the election of Thomas Jefferson and new political ideology going forward. The AP has this to say about this period. The British imperial attempts to resort and reassert control over its colonies, and the colonial reaction to these attempts produced a new American republic along with struggles over the new nation's social, political, and economic identity. What we're going to be looking at in this, we're going to be basically breaking this period up into 3 chapters. And the first chapter, chapter 4, we're going to break it into 2 different lectures. One, we're going to cover basically from the French-Indian War up through the very first sort of changes of British actions to the Americans. The next part will be basically all the things that the British do and the reactions that the colonists have that will eventually lead to Revolutionary War. So part A is going to be focusing on this part. Britain's victory over France in the imperial struggle for North America will lead to new conflicts among the British government. The North American led to new conflicts in American Indians, accumulating in the creation of a new nation, the United States. Okay, so what we really need to know in this first part of the chapter is this: how this French and Indian War was a turning point. It was a turning point that made the British-American relationship change. It is really vital that you get that. Again, we call that CCOT, or continuation and change over time, which has a lot of cause and effect relationships there. So we see this major event, the French-Indian War, and then we'll see major changes taking place because of this French-Indian War, and because especially the English indebtedness. They're so in debt because of this war. And then therefore we're going to see major American reactions to these changes. So it's really important to understand this was a major turning point. So this is why they use, if you look at this period, the 1754 as that turning point. Then you have 1800 as the next turning point, because that's going to be the election of a new political party from the foundation of America. And we'll get to that in a few chapters like we were talking about. Okay, so this first lecture is going to be really focusing on the French-Indian War and the immediate aftermath of this French-Indian War. It is also called the Great War for Independence, or Great War for Empire, sorry about that. It's also called the 7-Year War, even though it took about 10 years. Some of the vocabulary: the Ohio Company, Albany Plan, Ben Franklin, Fort Duquesne, George Washington, Treaty of Paris, Pontiac's Rebellion, and Proclamation Act of 1763. Those are ones you want to make sure you really know well prior to us coming back on Tuesday. Make sure you know those, because again, there could be some vocabulary quizzes regarding some of these major concepts of this first lecture. Okay, first thing you need to know is that the French and English problems were not in a vacuum. The French and English had long history of problems between these two countries, and they played out not only in Europe but also in the New World in America as well. A couple of the original ones that we talked about in the last unit was Queen Anne's War and King William's War, both in North America, and again, really both wars that you don't really know much about for AP, but just that both were attempts to expand each other's empires, and they both had conflicts with each other. So this French and Indian War of 1754 was not a new conflict between new countries. They both had conflicts. They've had wars in the past, and they both were trying to expand their North American entities. And here's why this war erupted. So, first of all, if you look at the territory, the French had a huge, vast land of territory. If you look basically from the St. Lawrence River Valley up through Montreal and Quebec, down through the Great Lakes, and all this area basically of the Mississippi Valley, all the way from the Great Lakes, all the way down to the mouth of the Mississippi. And they had huge amounts of land expansion with lots of forts and lots of fur trapping trading posts. However, though, there was very few French settlers in this area. The only really large settlement was right up and down this river valley, basically in Montreal and Quebec and some of these forts right up and down this river. The rest of it, even though they had populations there, it was just very sparse and it was mostly just trading posts. The Spanish was sort of out of it. Again, the Spanish were on the decline when it comes to their empire and their strength by the 1700s. They still had pretty big holdings in New Spain, but again, even those were become waned. So the Spanish was sort of out of it at this time for the North American landmass. The British, however, had huge populations by the mid-1700s all up and down this eastern seaboard, from Georgia through the southern plantations to the Chesapeake Bay plantations to the middle colonies of Philadelphia and New York City with the large trading posts, and then the New England areas with Massachusetts leading the way and huge population clusters up and down, and also huge amounts of resources as well. Okay, so because there was so much population with the English, and if you look at it, they're very limited in their land. They just basically had this coastal strip hemmed in by the Appalachian Mountains. So by the 1750s, land was in short supply for the English. So we see lots of English wanting to go over the Appalachian Mountains and start settling, especially if you look right there in this Ohio River Valley. Look where my cursor is. Sorry about that. So basically, the Americans were wanting to settle this region right in this area, about right there. Okay, that's going to basically put both the French and the English settlers, these Americans, into conflict with each other and into basically close proximity with each other. And that's going to be the major tension point that sort of like erupts into it. You also look at this fort right there, Fort Duquesne, which is right there, basically where present-day Pittsburgh is. And you see that's right on the edge between the French and the British territory. And that's going to be the spark that sort of starts this war, is this battle of the Fort Duquesne. So basically, we see the formation of the Ohio Company, which is a group of American settlers, planters from Virginia and other colonies, who are basically wanting to receive land grants over the Appalachian Mountains and into the Ohio River Valley. And of course, the natives were outraged. So they actually were very much in favor of French occupation in this area, because the French were not really wanting to settle this area. The French were only really wanting to go in there for fur trapping and hunting, not really planning on plantations and farms and habitations. So America saw this problem. Benjamin Franklin saw that the best way to deal with this problem early on is basically to get the Iroquois on the American side. So Franklin came up with this Albany Congress. Basically, let's meet. Let's have American colonies come together. Let's meet with the natives, and let's try to form a pre-war alliance. Let's try to reassure that the natives, that basically the Americans had no plan to permanently settle in all the area. They were just wanting some little areas to sort of expand their areas in. So basically, Franklin called for a plan to organize the American colonies together and to basically call for alliance with the natives, this Iroquois nation, that they basically needed to have alliances with to basically offset the French dominance in this area. So make sure you know this Congress will eventually lead to a plan, and this plan is going to fail. Basically they met in upstate New York, in Albany, New York, and the plan was, again, to propose this union of colonies along with an alliance with the Iroquois. Both parts of the plan failed. They both were voted down. Here's the significance, though. Even though this plan was voted down, it did show that in order to get strength, that the American colonies had to start coming together in colonial unity. This is really the first time that the colonies met as a united colonial body. Pretty much before that, Georgia was Georgia, New York was New York, Pennsylvania was Pennsylvania, with very little colonial connections to each other. So at least this got the colonies starting to discuss and talk about things as a colonial body. This will be important later on when they'll meet, not against the French, but against the British. Also, we see one of the most famous American cartoons in history. This is going to be really one of the very first American editorial or political cartoons drawn by Benjamin Franklin and posted in the Philadelphia Gazette. And it's this very famous segmented snake. You see South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England. And of course, New England being Vermont and Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And it's join or die. And really what it was focused for, join or die against the French. Not against the British, but against the French. Eventually, this will be also used against the British in the Revolutionary War as well to make the colonies come together. But the original penning of this cartoon was to line up colonies in preparation of a English-American alliance against the French against this war. Okay, so that's the setup of the war. What actually triggers the war is going to be basically the French construction of Western forts, especially the one of Fort Duquesne, right on the border between the American colonies and the French possessions. And the British will try to take this fort, but fail. And again, this is a failure of Washington. He'll basically lead his men into a huge loss. He'll leave with his tail between his legs with huge losses on the British side on this. Because again, he was not a general in this war, but he's a colonel in this war. And this will actually start this war, and this will be the spark that starts the war, the trigger that starts this war. And there you see Washington, going back, after this horrible defeat of his. So the war itself, you don't really need to know really any ins or outs about the war itself. The war itself was, sort of insignificant when it comes to the battle and stuff like that. When it comes to any one specific fight or battle or occurrence. Here's the big things you need to know. Obviously the pre-stuff. But obviously we need to know that the British and the Americans had huge advantages. We'll get to that next slide. They were allied with each other, with some Native Americans, but very few. The French had the Native Americans on their side, but the French had very little settlers in America. The war will also move to worldwide into Europe. Again, this doesn't really matter, but just know this was a world war as well. The British were allied with Prussia, the French were allied with Austria. This really becomes a great war for empire. Here's some stuff more about the American. One, the English had a huge advantage of population and resources. Because of the American colonies, there was a huge population advantage of 14-1 over New France. Also leading to that was also huge amounts of foodstuffs and other goods that were in much more abundance for the American and the British soldiers over the French soldiers. The British had one of the best navies in the world, way tops the French. Even though Washington failed as a colonel in this war, one really important thing about this is that he really learned British battle techniques, which will come into huge, the huge advantages during the Revolutionary War, because he'll learn these battle techniques firsthand and then learn how to sort of fight against those during the Revolutionary War. And here's some pictures of this war itself. Again, huge amount of Native Americans were fighting in this war as well. And most of the battles took place in Canada. You see lots up and down the St. Lawrence River, basically a lot in the Great Lakes area and on the western frontier. Basically no battles took place along the American colonies on the eastern seaboard. Again, there were some up in New York, in upstate New York, upstate New Hampshire, and again in the western parts of Pennsylvania, western parts of Virginia, but very little actual battles took place in the American continent itself. Okay, the aftermath of this war. The Americans and the British will win this war after 10 years of fighting. They will officially end this war with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. In this treaty, France gives up all of their North American holdings for the time being, 100% of their North American holding. So Americans and the British will gain all this pink area as well. Spain will also give up their Spanish Florida as well too, for the time being. So this is a great victory, especially for American colonists, because all of a sudden you have this small little coastal area. It's actually quite a few hundred miles between the coast and the Appalachians, but you have this huge coastal, this up and down coastal area that now hugely expands all the way to the Mississippi River. So everything basically east of the Mississippi River is now British territory. So if you're a colonist, you're like, awesome. We now have a huge amount of land that we can now move westward into. And there's no colonial body, there's no European body to manipulate this or take over this or be an issue for going in there. So the thought was that this was going to be a huge advantage for American colonists. You see another map of it, where basically now we have a huge expanse of British North America, pretty much from the Mississippi River all the way to the East Coast. Here's the problem. In this area of the pink, even though now the French are removed, there is still a massive number of Native Americans. And of course, they worked with the French because the French were wanting to inhabit and farm and field and city the land and populate the land. The French were wanting to hunt and gather and fur trap and trade. So now we see the English take control and the American settlers starting to flood over the Appalachian Mountains into this Ohio area, basically right around Ohio and this area right around Michigan. So it's basically this area of right where basically Ohio is, from the Ohio River all the way up to the Lake Erie in Michigan. Okay, so the Native Americans start to band together. One of the few times they do, we've already talked about a couple other times. Pope's Rebellion, the Metacom or King Philip's War, were the few times that Indians banded together. The Pontiac's Rebellion was another time these Michigan, Lake Erie, Ohio, Ottawan Native Americans band together and start attacking Western forts and settlements. In these, they take thousands of settlers. They storm forts. The British were able to push back the Native American advances in all these cases. They were able to protect their forts and basically push these Native Americans back. However, though, at a huge cost. At a huge cost. Right after a 10-year war that they basically outlaid huge amounts of money. So the British are in huge debt, and now they're having to pay even more to protect American settlements in the West. So the British were like, well, we can't have that. It's just too much cost. So here's going to be where the really first signs of major British parliamentary change are going to happen. Because of this huge cost to protect these Western forts and these Western lands, the British are going to pass something called the Proclamation Act of 1763. And there was a couple other acts we'll get to in the next lecture that happened before this. But this was really the trigger that started the change. The Proclamation Act, or the Proclamation Line that was set up, will be a line that runs up and down pretty much the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. And this was not a wall that's going to be set up. There was no sentries on this wall, but it was a line on a map that the British said is no longer able to be migration apart or across. So basically, the American colonists could not migrate westward across this line at all, stopping any settlement to the west. Well, like I said, the British had very little ability to enforce this. So many settlers still moved westward. They just couldn't officially own land, buy land, and they couldn't officially register that land as land that is theirs, because again, it wasn't legal. They still moved back there, and there still was resentment and just, we're not going to follow your directions. But again, they couldn't actually register that land as their own because it wasn't legal. So we're going to see this resentment starting to form against British authority and against the British actions. Okay, so I think as a historian is a really good way to think about how did Pontiac's Rebellion support the British argument for the proclamation. This is a great SAQ type of question. Basically looking at the French and Indian War, the Pontiac's Rebellion, and the proclamation, and how all those sort of paired together and basically were all connected. So make sure you're able to do that. Look at the lineage or the connection between those three things. Okay, that is our lecture for the day. We'll be going over more stuff in the lecture on Tuesday when we're going to be really looking at, well, now that we had the French and Indian War is over, how do we see the major starting, basically things changing? And remember, this is the end of solitary neglect. With this instance in the French and Indian War, we see the solitary neglect, the basically the British not really paying attention to the American colonies starting to fade and go away. For the 150 years prior to this, we see the very little British attention to the American colonies. Post-French and Indian War, we see huge tension and huge connection to the American colonies, and we see eventually this leading very quickly to a Revolutionary War. Also, some things to think about is what happened right before the French and Indian War. What big social movement that started to get people to question authority figures in their communities, especially religious authority figures. Great Awakening, right? This Enlightenment theory about, again, right at the same time here you saw John Locke spreading the English Bill of Rights and two trustees of government, and this whole new way of thinking that basically that people have these unalienable rights, that we can rebel against governments. And we start seeing this rebellion against these authority figures, these ministers. And so you also have all this American sort of new Enlightenment ideology revving its head at the same time. So you really have to look at all these different things being sort of all sort of coming together to fruition, all concurrently. With that, make sure you please take some notes. Please ask some questions in class on Tuesday. And there's going to be a little like a Google Forms quiz to go along with this lecture. So please make sure you answer that as well. The other parts of the homework assignment for Monday's class will be to watch a video and take some notes on that video, which will be in a Google class. Okay, everyone have a great day. We'll see you guys on Tuesday. Bye all.